I'm Ted Seides, and this is Capital Allocators. This show is an open exploration of the people and process behind capital allocation. Through conversations with leaders in the money game, we learn how these holders of the keys to the kingdom allocate their time and their capital. You can join our mailing list and access premium content at capitalallocators.com.
All opinions expressed by Ted and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Capital Allocators or their firms. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of Capital Allocators or podcast guests may maintain positions in securities discussed on this podcast.
My guest on today's show is Ben Hunt, the creator of Epsilon Theory and co-founder of Second Foundation Partners, where he writes and invests through the lens of narratives. Or in his words, if a price moves, it's because a human told themselves a story. Before turning to investing 20 years ago, Ben was a tenured political science professor and founder of 2 technology companies. He's been studying trends using what we now call big data ever since his first book about predicting international conflict in 1997. Our conversation covers Ben's path to finance, the power of stories, tracking and measuring narratives in markets, and applying the lens of narrative to investing. Ben's insights offer a careful consideration of what's really going on in markets. Before we get going, Brett Baraket shared some life lessons he learned from playing hockey on our podcast. He mentioned trying hard, having teammates that rely on you, winning every battle, and realizing that every shift is a new shift. All valuable gems from the sport that apply to investing and life. My 14-year-old son Eric has been training for boxing and recently stepped into the ring to spar. He's had some good moments and some tough ones in his early going. Here he is to discuss some of the lessons he learned from boxing.
After my first time getting knocked out, I learned a very valuable lesson. No matter what the other person throws at you, never let your guard down. But if you do get knocked down, get back up. Even after hearing my nose snap and blacking out, I popped back up, ready to fight. Well, just before my coach said, "What the hell are you doing? Get out of the ring." So if you do get knocked down, get back up. But, like my coach said, know when to quit. Taking my lessons to your work, when you do battle, no matter what the markets throw at you, never let your guard down. And if you do get knocked down, get back up. I mean, unless it's time to quit. Then maybe you need to find another job. But along the way, you'll improve your defense and your resilience by listening to the Capital Allocators podcast. Thanks so much for spreading the word.
Please enjoy my conversation with Ben Hunt. Ben, great to see you.
Great to be here, Ted. Thanks for having me.
Why don't you take me back to how you got on the path that eventually led to investing in investment research?
As my wife likes to say, I can't keep a job. So it's been a winding path. There's a thread that goes through the path, but it started in academia, right? So I was a political science professor of all oxymorons for 10 years, got tenure. I left academia to co-found a software company. And then from there, got into venture capital. And from there, got into public markets and investing there. So it's been a winding path, but there are at least 2 common denominators, common threads that string through all of it.
Why don't you pull them? Tell me what those common threads are.
Well, the first is that I've got the entrepreneurial bug. It's not a feature, it's a bug. I can't help myself but to be thinking about connections and a way to implement it. That's why I think at heart I didn't stay in academia, in the church, as I like to call it, our modern day church. It's not a place that lends itself to entrepreneurial thinking at all. And so to engage in that, I had to leave. And what I found in venture capital and then in public markets, which is really where I've been since 2005, it's that the ability to be entrepreneurial exists in this field, even if you're within a pretty large organization. So it scratches that itch for me. The other common thread, and this is really more applicable to what I do, is that I've always been consumed by $10 word or phrase, unstructured data, storytelling. So whether that's the stories we tell ourselves in politics, whether that's the stories that we tell ourselves in markets, that's always been the subject matter that just fascinates me. How can we find the structure in unstructured data? That's what my professional career has been all about.
So with that thread, take me back to when you were in academia. What did that look like when you were thinking about the storytelling and unstructured data in your first book?
The first book, it was called Getting to War, and it was a takeoff on, it was an old law school book called Getting to Yes. I don't know if you...
The negotiations book,
exactly.
Yeah.
We're of an age we remember these things. My field in political science was international politics, guns and bombs, security studies. My idea was that before a government would do something risky, start a war, start fighting with another country, they're going to tell efforts to tell a story to their people. So the idea was that by looking at domestic media, in particular editorials, which haven't changed in purpose or meaning for 200 years now, they are efforts to shape opinion. They're direct efforts to say, here's how you should think about a subject matter. To look at newspapers that were closely associated with a government, and I was going to do this across countries, across time. Is there structure there? Can you see a pattern in the opinion-leading efforts in media, the storytelling by governments to prepare population for war? And the answer is, oh my God, absolutely. That was the first work and research I did. It's the same research today, but trying to understand the patterns of storytelling in markets. Nothing's changed in the math. It's the same algorithms, it's the same network math that I was using 35 years ago. What has changed is big data. So the access to all this information, all this text information. What's changed is some of the terminology. We didn't call it natural language processing back then. That's what we were doing. We didn't call it language modeling back then, but that's what we were doing. And it's made possible by big data, big compute. It's changed everything about how to apply this research that I've been doing for 35 freaking years.
So when did you go back 30 years and it was, however you want to describe it, small data, where you didn't have the processing power we do today? How did you do it?
I would hire graduate students and undergraduates to go read microfiche. I don't think my kids even know what microfiche is. It's just pictures of these newspapers in the bowels of Widener Library. It wasn't quite punching cards, paper cards, but it wasn't far off. Again, I'm old enough to remember digital equipment in mini frames, and you would put your data in, and then the next day you would get some results to look at. In retrospect, it was challenging but wonderful because you are learning it from the start. You're learning how to make inference work so that when these inference machines, and that's the word you hear all the time, AMD and NVIDIA will talk about inference as where that's how they classify the use cases of their generative AI work. When you learn inference from the ground up, you understand just how powerful what we have today is, and you understand its strengths and its limitations. So wouldn't have it any other way. And it is wonderful to have a career arc that really, in a sense, comes full circle with the enormous focus today on inference, on text, on natural language processing. That's very gratifying.
What were the core lessons in going from software entrepreneur to venture capital and then to the public markets?
The core lesson for me is that it's all game playing. The game is different, but it's all playing a game. It's both the immediate game of the problem you're trying to solve, and then there's the meta game of how does the business work. And in fact, the way I got into public markets was a friend of mine was the head of research at a long-only shop. And we were always talking about companies that I was looking at or different technologies and the like. And he said, yeah, we're putting together a little group, going to start an internal long-short fund. Why don't you come join me over here? I said, I don't know. What do I know about it? And the answer was, I knew nothing. I knew nothing about public equity investing. But my friend said was, this is the biggest game in the world. And that's what sold me. So that was in 2005, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
So what was the transition from managing money, starting at that long short fund, to applying this in a different way through research?
When you come in, your investment approach is, what does your shop do? And this is a value shop, value with a catalyst. So that was my faith or my religion. That's how I was trained. And I was just learning how the game was played. And we did well, this little internal money, long short fund. We did well in 05. We did well in 06. We did well in 07. But everybody did well in 05 and 06 and 07. And then we did really well in 08. And that's where everything changed. So the money really started flowing in 08, and then really started flowing in 09. So the fund got up to, was close to $1 billion. But in March of 09, you were in a seat, so you know this story pretty well, Ted, right? So in March of 09, you went to the wall and you flipped a switch on our returns, and we just flatlined. We never lost money for our clients, and it's something that I'm really proud of to this day. But what was increasingly clear to me that what we did, value with a catalyst, it just didn't work. So in 2012, and this was, I'm pretty sure my wife still hasn't forgiven me for this, but we gave all the money back to our clients. It's a lot of money. In retrospect, like I say, it was the smartest business game decision I ever made because I didn't lose anybody any money. But it was hard at the time. We gave the money back because I wanted to figure it out. If you're responsible for other people's money, you say what you do and then you do what you say. Managing other people's money is not the time to figure something out. So I gave all the money back and decided, okay, I want to try to figure it out. What does matter for alpha, for edge? Because I was a true believer in the whole value with a catalyst story. And so I was trying to figure out, why doesn't that work anymore? And so for me, that was going back to, I'll call it my roots of working with unstructured data, with stories. What is it about the communication policy, forward guidance, the storytelling of the Fed that impacts markets so much? What is it about that? What is it about the way we tell stories in finance today? The growth of 24/7 news, say, and here I'm making the air quotes here, CNBC, Bloomberg, the Journal, which is FT, which are now 24/7 media companies, not just newspaper publishers. What is it about that and the way we tell our stories? What is it about the CEOs who come onto these shows and tell a story? What is a multiple if it's not a story? What is value investing if it's not, oh, I see something different in the story and I'm going to get paid when the rest of the world recognizes that I'm right? So that's when I started writing this blog, Epsilon Theory, where I wanted to try to figure this out in public. What is the role of storytelling? What is the structure in unstructured data? And how can we use that to be better investors and also, frankly, better citizens?
Where did the name Epsilon Theory come from?
It comes from the core econometric model. All familiar with it, right? So what are your returns? It's alpha, your idiosyncratic return profile in your portfolio. It's beta, how much you go along with the broad market. And then there's another Greek letter in there, and it's there in every econometric formula you'll come across, plus epsilon. So epsilon in econometrics, that's the error term, epsilon for error. And I named it Epsilon Theory, what I was writing about, because the fact is, epsilon is just what's not in your econometric formula. It's not error. It's what you don't know. Yes, there is error and stochastic stuff in there, right? But there's also human interaction, strategic interaction. There's also how humans systematically respond to story and the structures that exist in stories. So I named it Epsilon Theory because that's the place to explore, I'm convinced, to figure new stuff out. And that's what I was trying to do.
So what did you find?
What I would say is that what narrative is it's always reactive. It's not predictive. I have predictive views. Like, I think that generative AI is absolutely world economy, life-changing for the good. That's my personal view. Professionally, where I've got an edge is in seeing how narratives wax and wane. Events will happen in the world and narratives will shift to explain why and to where the narrative is and what the reaction to that's going to be.
How is that different from being predictive?
It's signaling and predictive in the short term. It is reactive in the sense that I don't know what the real world is. I don't know what the actual inflation rate is. I don't know what the CPI is going to be tomorrow. And analysis of narrative will not tell you what information is going to come out of the world. What I think I can tell you as an investor is what the market slant on that macro news or whatever comes out is.
This all reminds me a little bit of the Keynes beauty contest.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's part and parcel of that. This is the newspaper beauty contest, where a newspaper would print the pictures of 15 pretty girls. What Keynes said is the first level of decision-making is you look at the picture and say, okay, I think that's the prettiest girl. And that's like you're a discretionary portfolio manager like I was and say, oh, I think that's the prettiest stock. I'm going to short that or I'm going to go long that. Keynes says, that's not it. That's not how you play the game. But it's also not how you play the game to say, oh, I talked to a lot of my friends. I get a sense of the crowd. I think the consensus is that it's this other girl over here. Keynes saying that is also not how you play the game. What Keynes said is that you need to play at third level, meaning what does the crowd think that the crowd thinks? It's never about you. It's never what you think, and it's never what you think the consensus is. Always what does the crowd think? And the way that gets determined, and this is called the larger category here in game theory, is called the common knowledge game. And it's determined by what's called a missionary, that person who gets behind a microphone in front of a camera and shakes their finger at you and tells the crowd what they should think. And once you start looking for missionaries, you'll see them everywhere. And it's the stories they tell, and then the way those stories spread, that's what we're trying to analyze.
How do you start thinking about analyzing stories? If you're trying to figure out what this epsilon is, and there's something about storytelling and behavior in there, what do you do?
Let me start by telling you what it's not. It's not sentiment. This is a path that so many examinations of unstructured data have gone down that they tried to look for mean words and nice words. That ain't story. Story is a script. Story is a story arc. Story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Hollywood has figured this out for a lot of years. There are famously 5 scripts. My favorite example of this is the TV show Law and Order. I actually watch a lot of TV. People say they don't have time for TV. I say you make time for TV. But there have been 20-something seasons of Law and Order, and I haven't seen all 600 and something episodes, but I've seen a lot of them. Every episode has exactly the same structure. It's a 3-act play. About halfway through Act 1, you will be introduced to a tangential character, often played by a character actor who you'll recognize, a neighbor, a family member, an employee, but tangential to the crime that's being investigated. At the beginning of Act 3, that tangential character will return as the linchpin for the entire outcome of the show. Every episode has that structure because it works. What's true for Hollywood and what's true for the scripts of Hollywood, and you can type in the name of your favorite movie plus 3-act structure, and you can get a chart of what's called the rising action and the declining action, the 3-act structure. It's all the same. That's also true in markets. That's also true in what we read about why this analyst is bullish on a stock or why this commentator is bearish on this sector. We tell the same stories with the same structures over and over again. There are more than 5 in markets, but it's a finite number. And once you start looking for those structures, once you start thinking in those terms, it really changes everything about how you see what we do for a living.
What are some of the most used examples of the stories of markets?
Stories come about, I'll say, in 2 ways. Stories will be created in reaction to price. So earnings season, I don't know, who's first up with financials? It's JP Morgan. For whatever idiosyncratic reasons, they have a good report and the stock jumps 3-4% that day. The job of our news media is to tell you why. You can't just say, oh, yeah, guess it was a good quarter. Or what often happens when stocks move up and down, you can't just say, that was variance, right? Variance doesn't get eyeballs. Variance isn't a good story. You have to tell your reader, your listener, you have to tell them why. You have to tell a story. So that evening, Kramer will come on and he'll say, yeah, I'm bullish on the banks because XYZ. And he'll tell a story. That's not a knock on Kramer or anyone else who writes a story for the why. That's the job. So these stories of why we're now bullish on financials or why we now think that financials are cheap, they have words and phrases and an arc to them. And you can track the density of that language and the way it spreads virus-like. It's the same math that you use to track viruses. It's the same math that you'll use to track the words and their density across all the words that are being published and spoken in financial media. All the words every night. And you can then, with infinite computing processing power, you can track how these story arcs are growing or diminishing in density and how they're spreading out through the media body. The other kind of story is when somebody wants to change price or behavior. So this is the Fed is hawkish. The Fed is dovish. These are stories that are constructed in order to change behavior. So those are the two kinds of stories in general. Stories of why, to explain something that probably just happened by chance or for idiosyncratic reasons. And two, stories that are created to try to change your mind or change your behavior.
As you're trying to map out what's happening in markets through these stories, do you start with a hypothesis and then map the hypothesis? The alternative is, do you let the hypothesis come to you through the data?
It's always the first. So there are a couple of lessons that have served me well my entire life from being there at the beginning of understanding inference and large data set analysis. And the first one was a real mentor of mine. His name's Gary King. So he runs the whole social science quantitative research up at Harvard, and phenomenal guy. Wrote a book called Inference. I remember that first grad course on econometrics, and he was saying, look, all of what we're going to do, both in this course and in all the courses you're going to take here, it's lots of ways just to try to answer two questions. What's your best guess, and how certain are you? And he said, what you'll find is that in the real world, 99% of what people focus on is that first question, what's your best guess? And very little effort goes into, how sure are you about it? That second question, how sure are you? That is at least as important as what's your best guess. The reason this comes back to your question specifically about, do you start with I'll call it a deductive approach, where I'm saying, nope, I'm the human here. I'm going to say, this is how I think the world works, and then I'm going to test it. Or do you start by, let's let the data tell me what the patterns are? That latter approach, let's let the data tell me what the patterns are, that is at the key to inference, but is also how you fail in your efforts to say, I'm sure of this. You've got to start from the top down. It has to come from, this is the way I think the world works. And then you use inference as a tool to test your hypothesis and actually find ways to apply it. It can't be the other way around. How many back tests have you seen? There's it's a 3-sharp strategy on this back test. And then it goes live and it's, that didn't work.
So Ben, you started your investing career as value at the catalyst.
Yes.
Assessing fundamentals. And to some extent, when you're trying to figure out, say, the intrinsic value of a business, you're trying to get at some base truth of what something's worth, independent of what the markets are thinking. Stories seem like it's the opposite. What are people saying about what's happening? How do you think about the difference between the storytelling that you're seeing and what's true?
This has been a real evolution, Ted. I would say that I started off as a weak form narrativist, meaning that I thought, okay, narratives and story, that can drive price for a little while, but in pretty short, the truth, i.e. the fundamentals, will out. And over time, I became what I call a semi-strong form narrativist, meaning, oh, wow, stories can dominate for a lot longer than I thought, but I'm sure that ultimately the truth, i.e. the fundamentals, will out. I got to tell you, Ted, I am today a strong form narrativist. I think it's all stories all the way down. And that includes the stories we tell ourselves about value, about growth. The challenge with that is I always want to be right. I have opinions. There's no shortage of healthy ego in our business. You got to have a healthy ego to exist in this business. You got to say, I think X. The most difficult thing personally, but frankly, it's been the most important thing, I think, in learning how to manage other people's money in this world that we exist in. You must be profoundly agnostic. I don't know. And that's the hardest thing for a portfolio manager to say, I don't know. But that's the key to all of this. I don't know. I honestly, in the investment strategies we try to develop, I don't care about the truth. And that sounds terrible. I do very much personally. But for managing other people's money, I've had to come to the conclusion that, you know what? I think I'm a pretty good discretionary manager and all that. I think I've got pretty good ideas. But there are a lot of other people just as smart as me with as smart as ideas. What is my edge? Again, that fundamental question, how do you manage money for alpha in today's world? The only edge I've got is I think I can understand the storytelling. So that's what I'm looking for.
Let's take that down a level to how you do that. In theory, there's all these stories out there. How do you use all this big data into something that turns into an investment strategy?
There are two aspects to, I think, understanding story and then applying it to investing. The first is, what's the structure of the story? Meaning, what's the beginning, the middle, the end? What's the story arc? What's the language that one uses to say that you're bullish about financials? Or that the Fed should be hawkish? Or that in this business cycle, we're moving from late stage growth to recession? So the first step is to figure out what is the language model for those types of stories. And these are stories that we tell ourselves over and over again. And so we have tools and work to try to build what's the language model for the story. The second part of this is, what's the model for how human beings respond to these stories, to the news? In both of those, it starts from an experienced human saying, okay, these are all the stories that I'm familiar with in, I don't know, my commodity trading around the stories that I hear all the time. And then the second part of that is I might talk to an allocator like you, Ted. Tell me, what are the stories that you hear from commodity traders over and over again? So you build language models around both. You track all the news. Ultimately, what you're building, sometimes it's called a digital twin. You're trying to simulate the behavior of a trader or a PM or an allocator. You're trying to say, okay, I'm going to build an aggregate version of consumer discretionary traders. And I've got a model for A, what is happening in the news, and B, I've got a model for how they react to the news. That's how you do it.
As you frame this out, there's a couple different lenses that you've used to map out the narratives that exist. Why don't you describe what those look like when you're taking the concept of there's lots of stories and we're trying to map that out to something that you can look at on your desk?
So we do this in a couple of different ways. It all starts with that experience of being in this world of investing and saying, okay, here are the stories we've got, and then here are the tools we've got to build the language model around it. You can do this on any side. So you can do it in markets. You can do it on politics. One of the things we tried to do at Epsilon Theory is on I'll call it the social side is, what are some examples of the language and the language models and the words that are being used all the time when we hear stories about politics or sports or society or the like? We publicize that to give real examples of some of the stories and the types of language models that are used all the time to try to nudge you into thinking a certain way. Because at the core of our approach is that there have been these structural changes both in markets and in media and society that have pushed us towards this world of storytelling and people shaking a finger at you and using certain words to convince you of how to see the world. Because that's what you get all the time. We call it fiat news, right? It's not fiat money, it's fiat news, meaning it's not fake news, it's not a lie, but it's using words and phrases, it's using language, a script, to try to shake their finger at you and tell you how to think about the world. The types of stories that you hear all the time, again, this is as old as time itself. Plato and Aristotle called them sophists, sophistry, where you're trying to win the argument. 99% of what you'll hear on CNBC, and I'm not picking on them, this is just the business model of all 24/7 news organizations, both political news, but also market news. There's not enough, I'll call it hard news, to fill up 1% of the programming time. We're recording this on the day of a Fed press conference. So I was listening to that coming in today, and I was listening to the commentary, the opinion leading before the press conference. The announcement, the Fed statement, it takes a minute. Here's the statement. Here's what they're doing. They're not changing rates. Here's the statement. And then all the rest of the time is filled with people telling you how to think about that statement. There are patterns in how people tell you how to think about something. You can actually measure the language and the density and the like. And we try to provide that on Epsilon Theory for people to take a look at.
How do you take what you're seeing and turn it into an investment thesis?
The investment thesis here, it's all about the spread and density of the language, of the narrative. And it is absolutely the case that the important signals here are both the absence of something and the dramatic prevalence of something. So those are the signals. And we know this is how the world works. It's particularly on those stories that are designed to tell you why. When everybody's saying, oh, this is why, it is time to go the other way.
So there's always two countervailing narratives. One, the one you just said, everyone's telling you to zig, therefore you have to zag. The other is everyone's starting to say to zig, we can zig before them and benefit
Correct.
from that momentum, contrarianism. Why did you determine in that instance, if everyone is saying X, you better go the other way?
It feels very momentum-y, what I'm describing. And it really does feel like once you start seeing the world through the life cycle of narratives, what you'll see is that I literally see the world in terms of the rise and fall of these different narratives at different times. The business of Wall Street is to get you to buy. They must always be giving you a why. The business of Wall Street requires there to be a never-ending supply of whys. So that's why this works. You can't have the same why on and on. You've got to come up with a different why for a different sector or a different stock. Everybody's in on the act. CEOs do it. Wall Street does it. I mean, look at Tesla today. Elon is trying to construct a new narrative. The story, the reason you should put a big multiple on his stock is, oh, it's robo-taxis and humanoid robots. Forget the EVs. It's going to be robo-taxis and robots. And I'll be 5 years out or whatever it is. And let's get Kathy Wood to come up with her big report on why that's worth $20 trillion or whatever. This is narrative creation. This is what makes for a successful CEO today, Ted, is the ability to create and sell a story. And that's why it works for investing. It is a never-ending cycle, an ebb and flow of these narratives. And that's how you invest on it.
What are some of the narratives you're most focused on today?
There are, I'll call them the bread and butter narratives, meaning we're bullish on financials or we're bearish on consumer, whatever it is. That's like, it's the Muzak of Wall Street. It's always playing. Personally, my faith is still value with a catalyst, and I ran a big short book, and that's how I see the world as a short seller. I'm always looking at those sort of long vol, I'll call them trades. I'm fine with that. What are the systemic risks that are out there? And how can a technology and a practice of being focused on stories help us identify if and when those are real risks? I think there are those risks today. And I haven't felt this way in 14 years. My spidey sense is really tingling right now. And so really focused on away from the bread and butter of trades. I'm really looking at two geopolitical trades or concerns, right? China and Taiwan. And then what I like to call the phony war between Iran and Israel. And the third is around the rise of private credit and how that's a real shifting of risk. I don't think it's a creation of new risk. Remember the movie There Will Be Blood? It's a great film, tad dark, but there's this great scene towards the end where Daniel Day-Lewis is talking about sucking out all the oil from a neighboring field. And he uses that, I have a straw and I'm going to drink your milkshake, boy. I drink your milkshake. And honestly, that's what we used to call them shadow banks. It's interesting to me we don't call them that anymore. Is what the asset managers have done, particularly in the levered loan business, for the commercial banks. They drank that milkshake, right? Which is fine. Milkshakes get drunk all the time, and it's the way of the world. Fine with that. But it's a different set of risks around both the regulatory aspect of the asset managers in private credit and then the way they fund themselves. So there's a difference in the funding and a difference in the regulatory environment around the private credit world that I think it doesn't create new risk, but it shifts the risk there. And on both the funding side and on the regulatory arbitrage side, shall we say, it reminds me so much of 2007 leading into 2008. That's where I'm focused a lot of our narrative tracking for those sort of early warning indicators of the market caring about that.
So the private credit story, you hear that those types of loans are better deployed in the hands of asset managers because of the funding model for them. What creates the risk that you're attuned to that reminds you of 2007, 2008 going into it?
The main difference in the funding models that I see is that obviously they're not relying on deposits for a source of funding, but they're increasingly reliant on insurance premiums, right? Through captive or affiliated insurance and reinsurance entities. It's Apollo with Athene really got that ball rolling, but now they've all got their insurance affiliate and their reinsurance affiliate. So Blackstone's got theirs, Ares has got theirs, KKR's got theirs, Blue Owl's got theirs, right? They've all got this insurance, reinsurance edifice that's been created. And I get it, right? You want the float, you want the essentially permanent capital that exists there. But it reminds me for all the world, like Citigroup and the SIVs, as you recall back in 2005, 06, 07. You can't destroy risk. It's either created or destroyed. You just move it somewhere else. And my strong belief is that we've shifted around a lot of risk into the insurance, and particularly the offshore reinsurance world, where leverage ratio is incredibly high, increasingly invested with affiliates. And we all know what that means. But it's the reason I say it reminds me of Citigroup and the SIVs. It's an effort to take risk off balance sheet. But when the shit hits the fan, that risk comes back on balance sheet. And understanding the regulatory arbitrage that's going on here now is where I'm really focused. Because it's not just the stories we tell to investors through the media, it's stories we tell to regulators also.
What are you trying to understand about the stories to the regulator?
There should not be regulation, essentially. This is at the core, I think, of so much that's happening in the commercial banking world. You have incredible regulation that creates entities that cannot fail, in the form of JP Morgan, Citi, B of A, and Wells. Those are the four. You've got your own issues around everyone who's outside of that protection with, God knows, we saw that last March with the regional banks and First Republic and all like that. The regulatory requirements on capital are what drives, I think, everything in the banking world today. What's our capital requirement on doing X, on making this loan? Or it's too much, so we don't want to be in that business. So you get a less regulated entity, the asset managers, drinking that milkshake. And because they're less regulated, and let's be honest, they're smarter than the regulators in setting up the affiliate structure between the insurance platform and the reinsurer. And then, let's offload this. Let's create some insurance-linked security. That all started with cat bonds, and now you can do it with anything. You've created this enormous edifice that, again, looks all the world to me like RMBS, Alt-A, all the CLOs becoming the new CDOs, and it's the whole cast of characters. It's a story that is rhyming.
How does it become a problem?
I think there are two possible catalysts. The first is that, and this is true when you look at it, I'll think about banks and the loan book. Right? You look at problems on the loan book, and I think there are growing problems on the private credit loan book, on the asset side. And then I think there are growing problems on the liability side, on the funding piece. And it's that piece, particularly the offshore reinsurers and the use of leverage and the increasing need to invest in, quote unquote, affiliates, right, that aren't arm's length and have a lot of issues. There's a lot of smoke here. I think there's some fire. It's got my spidey sense all tingly. And so it's developing the language models here, because what a language model can do is not just tell you how it's spreading, but also can be used as an early warning device, a signaling device for when you see these stories starting to pop up.
Let's turn to the geopolitical stories.
I'll start with Iran and Israel. I characterize that as a phony war in reference to the 1939, the phony war, which was after Germany invaded Poland, France, most of the declared war on Germany. And it was a real war, real conflict. People died. But it was called the phony war because it was pretty quiet for about 6 to 8 months. The market has said, we're just going to put this in a box over here, Iran's missile and cruise missile and drone attack on Israel. Say, that happened, and now we're going to put this in a box over here and pretend it didn't happen. Well, it did. There is a hot war between those two countries. It is in its phony war stage. I don't think it remains in a phony war stage, or I think the risk is that it doesn't. And I think the way you can try to get some insights on that is to look at the domestic media in both of those countries. Ditto with China and Taiwan. You had a new Taiwanese president elected last month. You had China respond by encircling the island as part of a war game exercise. And you basically heard boo about that over here in the States. This front page in Japan, kind of nothing, very little over here. Again, I think the way to track this is to look at domestic media in China, and that's one of the things we do a lot of.
What are you seeing that other observers in the States might not through that work?
I'm not ascribing agency to this. I think that the water in which we swim as an observer in the U.S., as a market participant in the U.S., is going to be driven by what is presented. And from now through November, what is going to be presented in front of us is a nonstop diet of political news and the nonstop diet of when is the Fed going to cut? That's what is presented to us nonstop. So I get it. That's what we pay attention to. What I think that a focus on narrative can do for everyone is to give you a critical distance with what you are hearing. I'm not saying to fight what you're doing. I'm not saying you fight the Fed or you're not. On the contrary, right? I'm saying this can be a driver for going along with it or not, but you have to understand this is what's happening. And you have to ask yourself the question, I think, all the time, why am I reading this now? Why is this being presented to me? Why am I being told this story? And what stories are not being told to me? The focus I'm talking about provides critical distance and requires you to go actively search for the stories that are not being presented to you. And those stories that I think that are so important are the stories that other countries and their governments and their commercial entities are presenting to their people. It's always the domestic media that I find gives the most signaling power. That's true for our domestic media signaling to us, but it's also true for understand what's happening in China or Iran. I want to look at what their governments are telling their own people.
What narratives are missing in the U.S. today?
I think that there's a crowding out effect with narrative. I'll focus on the China narrative and the Iranian narrative. Our attention around Israel is understandably on the Gaza war. I get it. That is a thing to pay attention to. It crowds out the phony war that now exists between Iran and Israel. It crowds out everything else that's happening over there. It crowds out thinking about Russia and Europe. It crowds out China and Taiwan and China and the Philippines. It crowds all of that out. It's natural. I get it. But I think it's so important that you don't allow yourself to be crowded out that way.
What does it mean if we are crowded out by those other important things that are happening?
We get surprised when these other important stories that have been crowded out, when they do click. Because when I say that I'm a strong form narrativist and that it's all story, I also think that the stories that are being told that we're not paying attention to, those are also important stories. And when those hit, we'll regret that we weren't paying attention to them. That's why it matters.
All right, Ben, I want to make sure I get a chance to ask you a couple closing questions. What is your favorite hobby or activity outside of work and family?
I just love playing games, Ted. I love all card games, bridge, poker, pinochle, play anything. And I don't really care about gambling, although I grew up in North Alabama where we would bet on which raindrop on the windowsill would hit the bottom first. So I love that. That's very natural to me. But for me, it's just playing games. I play Dungeons and Dragons. It's crazy. I love that stuff.
What's one fact that most people don't know about you?
My grandfather was a dairy farmer, and he would laugh for me to call myself a farmer. He would have a great belly laugh about that because I'm just a dilettante farmer where if I have a bad day, it's the artisanal mezcal and the amuse-bouche at the local farm-to-table restaurant. So I feel silly calling myself a farmer, but that dilettante farmer has been this kind of stock comedic character since Roman days, and I feel comfortable with that. It has been magic to live with animals and to raise a family around that. It's been absolute magic. I write about that a lot, so maybe people do know that about me. That's given me a grounding and a sense of what is important away from this ersatz narrative world that you and I live in. Anyway, that's been the best.
What is the magic that you've gotten out of being around the farm?
It's a connectedness with, is the Disney song, the circle of life that is for real. And allowing your children to have responsibilities where the life of this animal depends on them doing their chores every day and then experiencing going through that life cycle. It's hard to put into words how grounding that is, both for me personally, but also for my children. That's the magic.
What's your biggest pet peeve?
People telling me how to think. It's probably why I'm all into the storytelling. I hate it when people shake their finger at me and tell me how I should think about something. Just can't stand it. I'm smart enough to make up my own damn mind.
Which two people have had the biggest impact on your professional life?
One would be, I mentioned earlier, Gary King, really a mentor for me in grad school. And the second would be the founder of the firm where I got my start in public markets. So that was David Cohen. And yeah, I learned a lot of lessons from David, mostly good lessons, understanding the game of markets.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
Friend of mine in Houston, amazing advice. Always go to the funeral. Always go to the funeral. It's difficult. It can be hard. It can be time consuming. And it's not that if you don't go, it's not that you'll be missed. It's not that the group there will say, oh, well, I wonder why Ben didn't come to this. That's not it. But if you go, I remember this from my father's funeral. So I remember this personally. I have experienced this from other funerals I've been to. There's a nuclear reactor of positive goodwill and connection that exists between the bereaved and the people who show up. So that's my best advice. Always go to the funeral.
All right, Ben, last one. What life lesson have you learned that you wish you knew a lot earlier in life?
I wish I knew how important it was to pay attention and work at professional networking and connections. This is true in academia. This is true in finance. It's the advice I always give to younger people there. If you're in a big organization, you always need to be looking for your next job. And I don't mean that in the sense of you've got your resume out there and you've got one foot out the door. What I mean by that is you're in a transactional relationship with this large organization, and when push comes to shove, they have no loyalty to you. It means you need to be making the personal connections outside your organization, in your field. Those are the connections, the human connections, that will serve you in good stead for a long career in a space. I wish I'd known that earlier.
Ben, thanks so much for sharing this narrative about narratives.
It's really my pleasure, Ted. I really appreciate you having me on. This was a blast.
Thanks for listening to the show. To learn more, hop on our website at capitalallocators.com, where you can join our mailing list, access past shows, learn about our gatherings, and sign up for premium content, including podcast transcripts, my investment portfolio, and a lot more. Have a good one, and see you next time.